Praise be to God. Today's Bible portion is from the book of Leviticus, from chapters 23 till 25. Chapter 23 is about the special holy days the Israelites were to observe throughout the year. The Israelites were to observe the Sabbath day of rest every seventh day of the week. We read about the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread from verses 4 till 8. The Passover feast was to be observed on the 14th day of the first month. The next day, which is the 15th day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread began and lasted 7 days. The first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread was a holy convocation, and no ordinary work was to be done. The seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was also designated as a day of holy convocation. We read about the celebration of first fruits from verses 9 till 14. When the Israelites inherited the land of Canaan, they were to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of their harvest to the priest, so the sheaf could be offered to God. The sheaf was to be offered the day after Sabbath. In addition to the sheaf, on the same day, the Israelites were to offer a male lamb as a burnt offering, 1/5 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a food offering, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering. Grain from the new harvest wasn't to be eaten until after this offering was made. Then we read about the Feast of Weeks from verses 15 till 22. The Israelites were to count off 50 days from the offering of first fruits. The 50th day was designated as the Feast of Weeks. On that day, a grain offering of 2 loaves of bread was to be brought to the priests. 7 lambs, 1 bull, and 2 rams were to be offered as burnt offerings. 1 male goat was offered as a sin offering, and 2 male lambs were offered as fellowship offerings. The day was declared a holy convocation to the Lord, and ordinary work was not to be performed. We read about the festival of trumpets from verses 23 to 25. The first day of the 7th month was dedicated as the day of rest for the people. The day was to be marked by the playing of trumpets. From verses 26 till 32, we read about the Day of Atonement. The 10th day of the 7th month was the Day of Atonement, when the high priest entered the most holy place to sacrifice for his own sins and the sins of the people. The specific sacrifices that were to be offered on this day were discussed in Leviticus 16. The day was a holy convocation and no ordinary work was to be done. The Israelites were to afflict themselves. From verses 33 till 44, we read about the Festival of Tabernacle. On the 15th day of the 7th month, the Israelites were to observe the Festival of Tabernacle for 7 days. The first day was a holy convocation. Each day, the people were to bring food offerings and rejoice before the Lord with the fruit of their splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees and willows. On the 8th day, another food offering was to be brought, and the people were to abstain from work. During the celebration, the people were to live temporarily in tents, so their descendants will know that the Lord had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when He brought them out of Egypt. In chapter 24, we read about the olive oil and the bread set before the Lord, and how a blasphemer has to be handled. We read about the golden lampstand from verses 1 till 4. The priest was to manage the lamps on the golden lampstand in the tabernacle each day. The lights were to be kept burning continually from evening till morning. From verses 5 till 9, we read about the bread for the golden table. Each week, the bread was prepared and placed on the golden table in the tabernacle. The bread was replaced each Sabbath day, and the old bread was given to the priests. 12 loaves of bread was made each week. They were to be arranged in 2 stacks, and by each stack, some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread was put, and to be a food offering presented to the Lord. And from verses 10 till 16, we read about the punishment for blasphemy. These verses describe a situation where a young man blasphemed the name of the Lord during a fight with another man. The young man who blasphemed was arrested. Moses asked the Lord what needed to be done with the blasphemer, and the Lord told Moses he was to be killed for his disrespect. The Israelites took the man out of the camp and stoned him. Moses warned the people, saying, "Whoever curses God shall bear his sin." We read about the requirements of justice from verses 17 till 23. If a man murdered another man, the murderer was to be put to death. If a man killed an animal which belonged to another, he he was to replace the animal with an equivalent. If a person injured their neighbor through violence, the injury inflicted on the victim would be inflicted on the aggressor. In chapter 25, we read about the Sabbath year. From verses 1 till 7, we read about the 7th year Sabbath. God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai and instructed the Israelites to keep a 7th year Sabbath. The Israelites were to farm their land for 6 years, but in the 7th year, they were to let the land rest. From verses 8 till 22, we read about the 50th year Jubilee. When the Israelites entered Canaan and made it their home, the land was divided up and given to families by casting lots. Each family received a portion of land that was to remain theirs forever. The Israelites were instructed to celebrate every 50th year as a Jubilee. On the year of Jubilee, all the land that had been leased was to be returned to the original owners. The Jubilee year was also a year of rest for the land. The Israelites' fields were to remain unplanted and unharvested. Following the year of Jubilee, if a family wanted to lease their land to someone else, they were to charge a price based on how many years were remaining until the next Jubilee, when the land would return to them. If the Israelites kept God's instructions regarding the 7th year Sabbath and the year of Jubilee, God would bless the land and make its produce in abundance. From verses 23 till 28, we read about the sale and redemption of the land. Plots of land in Canaan were never to be sold permanently because the land belonged to God. Land could only be leased. If a poor man leased his land due to financial troubles, he had the right to redeem the land if he desired. A close relative also had the right to redeem the land. If the land was not redeemed, it remained in the possession of the one who leased it until the Jubilee year. From verses 29 till 34, we read about the sale and redemption of houses. In regards to the sale of houses in walled cities, if a house in a city was sold, the seller had the right to redeem it for 1 year following the sale. If they did not redeem it, the buyer became the owner of the property and did not have to return it during the Jubilee year. This was true with one exception. If the house belonged to a Levite, the house had to be returned in the year of Jubilee because the Levites didn't receive a portion of land when the Israelites took possession of Canaan. Additionally, a Levite had the right to redeem his house anytime the 1-year time limit didn't apply. From verses 35 till 46, we read about the laws related to poor Israelites. If an Israelite man fell on hard times and was unable to support his family with food and shelter, it became his richer neighbor's responsibility to give him a place to live and food to eat. The neighbor was not allowed to loan him money at interest or sell him food for profit. If a poor Israelite sold himself to a fellow Israelite, the poor Israelite was not to be treated like a slave but as a hired servant. The hired Israelite was freed from his service in the year of Jubilee. The Israelites were allowed to buy slaves from the nations around them, but they were not to make slaves of their own countrymen. From verses 47 till 55, we read about redeeming poor Israelites from a foreigner. If an Israelite became poor and sold himself to a foreigner living in Canaan, he had the right to be redeemed by another Israelite, a close relative, or he could buy his own freedom if he became wealthy. The price to buy his freedom was based on the number of years until the next Jubilee. If the Israelite was not redeemed, he was to be given liberty on the year of Jubilee. This marks the end of chapter 25. Thanks for listening. Hope it was useful. God bless.